And I don't want to downplay like physical abuse because I had many experiences where it's weird to think or say out loud, but I could have died in certain situations. And so it is definitely a dangerous, very serious situation to be in. And if that's the case, you know, I would say just get your things and leave.
So I just came across a report that linked turmeric and ashwagandha and a couple of other herbal supplements to liver damage and liver injury. So I just wanted to bring that up before we get into our content today because people get really alarmed when they see these types of reports. And often I did look into this because turmeric, of course, is a spice and its active constituent is curcumin. And curcumin has been shown to have a lot of health benefits. It's very anti-inflammatory. And actually, when you look into the studies, curcumin is associated with liver protective qualities, and it's actually been shown to be liver supportive and lower liver enzymes. So I think in these studies, or in these cases, I should say, of people who have reported liver injury, which is a very, very small number. And, the reason I'm mentioning this is because I take curcumin daily because it's very anti-inflammatory and really good for my achy knees. And I notice a huge difference when I'm taking it. So a lot of people are alarmed by this, but I think that in the cases of liver injury, it was due to actually just taking turmeric with black pepper, which increases its absorption. And so turmeric and curcumin are actually two different things. So curcumin, like I said, is the active constituent in turmeric. And when it's extracted, it might have different qualities than turmeric itself. So I just wanted to point that out because these headlines are making the rounds and I get my clients freaking out saying, you told me to take curcumin or I'm taking curcumin. And now I see it's linked to liver injury. And just two takeaways, very, very small number of cases and probably associated with turmeric, not curcumin. And when you take turmeric with black pepper.
Whoa, that's actually super interesting because when I was learning about curcumin, they always told us to take it with black pepper, or a lot of formulations will have black pepper in it. So is it specifically the black pepper that's causing the liver injury?
Yeah, so it's not necessarily black pepper itself, but black pepper, the reason you're told to take it with turmeric is because it increases its
Right.
absorption like by I
Exactly.
don't not even know how much, but so it's possible in these cases people were taking like mega doses of
I see.
turmeric with black pepper that increased its absorption. And another important takeaway here is that more is not always better when it comes to supplements. People think
Yes.
this is a magic bullet. If I take 500 milligrams, what if I take a whole gram? And
Yeah.
that's not always the case. The dose makes the poison.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially with herbs. I feel like herbs are also medicine. And so we need to be very careful on how we ingest them. But I'll
Oh,
say the same thing for
absolutely.
nutrients. Yeah, and nutrients are the same way. Vitamins and minerals have an upper limit as well. So, yes, a lot of them are water soluble, but a lot of them are fat soluble, which means they stay in your system. So, vitamin D is an example of that. A lot of people are deficient in it. We need to take it. But if we take too much of it and we don't test to see our base levels or see our levels after we're, taking it for 3 to 4 months, it can accumulate in our body into really high doses.
Yeah.
So anything, like you were saying, Mary, can be dangerous. So that's actually a really good call out. And yeah, I had assumed that maybe it had something to do with dosage, but the black pepper thing was really interesting.
Yeah, and it could just be that curcumin's fine and turmeric was the issue. I have to do more research on it, but just something important to call out.
Yeah, yeah, always good to hear. So, today's episode is a little bit different than what we have been talking about, but because this is a women's health podcast, we thought it was important to address again experiences that Mary and I have been through in terms of being in relationships that may not have been the healthiest, specifically being abusive, whether that could be physically, emotionally, verbally. And we kind of want to just touch on this.
Yeah, this being a women's health podcast, we're not only touching on nutrition and health topics, we are also touching on relationship dynamics, emotional wellness, movement, all of these facets that go together to create health. So there's a lot more than just your nutrition and your movement in terms of dictating health. Relationships have a huge impact on your well-being for better or worse. And this is something, relationship topics is something that we are going to cover in many different ways in upcoming episodes. And the reason that this is coming up now is I have my side project on my Substack where I write about mental wellness and emotional well-being and mental health. And I wrote an article on emotional abuse and verbal abuse specifically in relationships. And it got so much traction and feedback that it seemed like a good topic here to cover. And Carla, you and I both have had experience with emotional abuse and physical abuse in relationships. And the amount of stress that it causes can really affect your health.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's more common than people think,
Oh,
especially
yeah.
men. It's always surprising when I start dating someone or I'm in a relationship with someone and the question I get asked is, why did you stay?
Oh, God. Yeah.
And, that's really telling that they have no idea about the experience, the brainwashing that goes on, the gaslighting, the manipulation. Your brain chemistry changes, your confidence, your ability to trust in yourself changes. All of these things that were normal to you and you could think very clearly when you're in that type of relationship, it just really fucks with your head and your ability to make certain decisions.
Yeah. And I just want to clarify too what we'll start with verbal emotional abuse because it's so insidious. And I was in a very emotionally abusive relationship in my 20s and I had no idea that what was happening was even considered abusive. It didn't feel good. And I just assumed that these types of arguments that are characterized by verbal abuse, which is name calling is a big one, making you feel small, belittling you, mocking you, gaslighting you, which is trying to distort your reality and make you question your reality and deny your reality. So gaslighting is a term that gets thrown out a lot, but that's what it means. So there's this constellation of symptoms, you could call them, in a relationship that dictate verbal and emotional abuse. And like I said, obviously physical abuse is very obvious, but emotional and verbal abuse, I just thought this was a normal part of arguments when, people get aggressive. Yelling is another huge hallmark. I thought yelling was a totally normal thing in a relationship in my 20s because I grew up in kind of an emotionally abusive household. And so if you're accustomed to that and that's something that perhaps you grew up with, then you tend to normalize these behaviors, which are actually very destructive.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, really, who doesn't nowadays? To find a secure person who had a great parental example and a happy, secure marriage, I feel like is close to impossible. And, same with me. Like, I didn't have the perfect parents with the perfect marriage. And so I grew up a lot with stonewalling and the silent treatment. And that is all I
Mm.
saw and knew. And, just until maybe a few years ago or a decade ago, I really start to understand how I grew up affected me now in relationships and the way I behave, the way I think, the way I act is all a reflection of, unfortunately, like my childhood. And if someone doesn't realize that, it can really, really make a relationship very, very difficult, sometimes even toxic.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because we're going to talk about attachment styles in upcoming episodes, but you're touching a little bit on how in childhood, our primary caregivers are the first people that we form attachments to. And if they're giving us inconsistent care and our needs aren't fully met, this can create anxious and avoidant attachment styles. And these people are more likely to be both emotionally abusive and suffer with emotional abuse. And that's really important, is how our childhood and our environment, and not only just our, primary caregivers, but what happens in the home. And I experienced subtle forms of emotional abuse and yelling and things like that in my childhood. So I just, like I said, I thought this was normal. And it wasn't until I started going to therapy in my 20s, when I was in this abusive relationship with someone who not only was verbally and emotionally abusive, but incredibly controlling and manipulative, isolated me from my family and friends, extreme jealousy. All these constellation of symptoms that can go into emotional abuse. And I didn't know that that's what it was until I went to therapy and told my therapist what was happening. And she said, that's abusive, right? That's considered verbal or emotional abuse. And then we started to get into it in therapy sessions and unpack it and determine, how did I get here? How do you leave? And so that's why we're doing this episode. Is there are so many women out there potentially experiencing this who don't realize that it's not normal, and the stress that it creates, and just this fight or flight nervous system response. And
Yeah.
one other thing I wanted to say really quickly is, it's also marked by this pattern of, like, the abuse happens in an argument or however it comes up. And then there's usually the person is extremely remorseful. There's this period of remorse where they kind of try to win you back and perhaps go over the top with gifts or whatever they can do to apologize for their behavior, say it never happens again, it's never going to happen again. This incredible regret and remorse. And it's a pattern. It will happen again
Yeah.
unless
Yeah.
the person gets help.
Exactly. And we're specifically talking about like abusive situations, not just normal fighting and, saying it's not going to happen again. So I just want to make sure that there is a distinction there. But yeah, I know when like the last straw of my physically abusive relationship, actually it was physically, emotionally, all of it. But when that happened, I went public with it because I had been silent for so long, for so many years, and it affected me so much. And there was so much shame inside that I wanted people to know what I had been going through. And I was, I would say more selective than just making it public to everyone. It was definitely friends and family. But when that happened, I also got a lot of backlash from his friends and family, calling me a liar, calling me a bitch, saying that I'm making all of this up for attention. And that is when I realized how not only dangerous these situations are, but how
Women being blamed. I think it's like victim blaming.
yeah, and how isolated it feels, right? Like do you think you're doing the right thing by coming forward and finally telling your truth? And then you are just being, again, just, hit over the head and be told to stay silent and that you're wrong and that it never happened. So it's like gaslighting all over again. And it was
Yeah,
an
totally.
incredibly, yeah, it was an incredibly difficult experience to go through. But on the other side, I got also an overwhelming response from, those that I knew were like my true friends and family. And, they came up and just gave me the kindest words and, the warmest hugs. And we're just insanely shocked because if you know me, I personally would never have thought I would have gone through something like that. They never thought I would have gone through something like that. They knew that person. That's the other thing. These people are typically very charismatic. They're very
Mm,
nice,
charming.
uh, you know, extremely charming, extremely funny, extremely nice to be around. And then behind closed doors, it's a completely different story. And, this is my first time experiencing this. And I always describe people as it was like Jekyll and Hyde. I didn't know when that switch was going to happen. I might have had just an inkling with alcohol, but
I
otherwise,
was going to say, yeah, alcohol can be a huge
that
catalyst.
that was a big thing for sure. But even then, there was still a lot of shame, anger, pain, hurt. And, as I got to know this person, it was definitely stemming from their childhood and their past experiences. And I'm just in a relationship, I just want to help. And unfortunately for me, I stayed too long. I crossed the line in trying to make their business my business. And that is when I think as women, we need to see when you are hurting yourself more than you're helping them. And
That was a really
just say,
profound statement. Yeah.
and say no and walk away. And I know that is not easy. And so I don't want to, make that seem super black and white, but that is something that I just really want to highlight for anyone who is maybe currently in that situation. If you're feeling emotionally drained, if you're feeling unsure of yourself, if you're feeling like your confidence is, you've hit rock bottom and you don't feel like you can trust this person anymore, I think that's a big red flag.
Oh, yeah. And these people typically only get better after therapy and a lot of work. And I actually took my ex, who was emotionally abusive, to therapy with me. And also, he found his own therapist because I kind of had a bottom line that this relationship can't continue unless you get help and go to therapy. And he went to therapy and reported back after his first visit to therapy. The therapist says, I'm fine. I don't need therapy. You're the problem.
Oh
And
my
so
gosh.
that's first of all, no therapist would ever say that, right?
Yeah.
Um, but
No
that's
good therapist.
that's very characteristic of emotional abuse is, well, this is your fault. And there's a big victim mentality there. Well, the way that you talk to me makes me act this way. It makes me call you names because you're antagonizing me. Your behavior is what's making me abusive. So that's one of the hallmarks is the victim blaming the victim for making them act that way, which is of course akin to in physical violence, like you make me hit you because you act this way. And that's incredibly fucked up and very damaging.
Absolutely. And incredibly immature. As an adult, no one can make you do anything. You
All
are
right.
fully responsible for
For
your
your own
actions,
emotions.
emotions, reactivity, all of it, right? I mean, this is something I had to really look back on last year because I am very reactive or had been in the past. And that is something that I have been working on for a while and am being very mindful of now in conversations. Not, I mean, it's specifically in like romantic relationships. I feel like this comes out. It's never with like friends or family. For whatever reason, our worst selves come out with our partner.
Oh
I,
yeah,
right?
100%.
It's weird. I still can't truly explain it other than there's probably no other person that you're as close to or comfortable with. And so you're just willing to let all the filters go, which is probably the person that you should have somewhat filters if you want to have a healthy dynamic and conversation.
So I also wanted to touch on, we kind of mentioned this really briefly, but how this behavior happens in people. And I always say to myself, like, no one sets out to be an abuser, right? And it's something that starts probably early in childhood because these people have a very similar profile where they were usually emotionally abused, physically abused. They grew up in really traumatic childhoods. And it comes from this place of, in my experience, very low self esteem. And these kind of mechanisms come out, this control mechanism trying to make you feel small because ultimately it's a fear based behavior. Being verbally and emotionally abusive kind of comes from this place of fear. And I have a lot of compassion for these people because they're really in a lot of pain and they really need help and therapy. And of course, the wisdom is if you are experiencing any type of abuse, then you need to leave. But if the person is also willing to really look at their behavior, and in my experience, it has not been that way. They have classically always blamed me, the other person, and not been willing to look at their own role in this. But if they are and they're aware of it, can really go to therapy and work on it, then of course I would support recovery for that. But sadly, in my experience, that's not the majority of cases. I don't know, honestly, but in my experience is the person was unable to look at his behavior and instead it was always the other person's fault.
Yeah, for sure. And, to your point around taking actual responsibility and doing something about it, it's not just talking. Like you
Mm,
can't just say, I'm going to go to therapy. And
right.
even if you do go to therapy, it's worthless if you don't put those recommendations or whatever you learn into action. And that unfortunately has been my experience,
Mm.
going to therapy with a partner, we're learning all the things and then nothing actually changes or nothing gets
Yes, that's a
implemented.
really good point. You have to
It's so
actually
frustrating.
you have to implement what you're learning in therapy,
Yeah.
right? And
Both
not
of
just
you, of
not
course.
just phone it in by attending therapy,
Yeah.
but you have to
Yeah.
use the tools. And
Right.
essentially that's what therapy teaches you is how to be a better communicator because regardless of the fact that we're all humans and we use our words to communicate, most people are very poor communicators. It is a skill that you learn.
Yeah.
Just because you can talk and use words doesn't mean that you're a good communicator.
That's
And
so
in
true.
my experience, most people are very poor communicators, and therapy gives you the tools to both, actively listen to someone else and how to communicate effectively. And that's why I think everyone should go to therapy. It not only improves your relationship to yourself, but teaches you really important communication skills with others, whether it's your children, your romantic partner, your office mates. So,
Yeah.
yay for therapy.
No, I completely agree. I found that it is insanely hard to find a great therapist.
Oh,
I
totally.
even right now am struggling with it. I've been through so many, and it is like an exhausting process. You're having to tell your life story over and over and over again just to find the right fit. And then when you do, maybe you go in 2 to 3 sessions and you're like, actually, you're not a good fit. And then you have to start that process all over again. And it's a
Totally.
real turnoff, to be honest.
No, you're right. I mean, having a connection with a therapist is really important. And there are a lot of kind of online services these days, like BetterHelp. I think Headway is another one that helps to make therapy more affordable. And if you don't click with your first therapist, you can request another one. And until you find the right fit,
Right.
until you feel comfortable, you can change therapists. But yeah, you're exactly right. It is it can be a long process.
Yeah. And I think the point that I want to drive here with therapy and tying it into abusive relationships, if anyone listening out there may think that that's the case for them, you going to therapy in this time in your life right now will help to bring so much clarity to your situation. And it's not that the therapist is going to tell you what to do, but they are going to be that outsider that you need,
Hmm.
that unbiased outsider, right? Because going to friends sometimes is not the person you're going to necessarily listen to because you have a relationship with them. But having someone completely disconnected from your life, knowing you, and just being an unbiased observer can really give you a clear perspective as to what is going on and helping you navigate the situation in a safe, effective way to get out.
Yeah. And while you were talking, I was thinking, well, of course I was listening, but I was, that's one of my big pet peeves is when someone else is talking and you have whatever you're going to say queued up in
Yes.
your head. Speaking of good communication, being a good communicator means being a good listener. But what I was thinking about, yeah, so while you were talking, I was thinking, going back to what is driving people to go to therapy, whether you're just looking to better yourself or whether you suspect there's emotional abuse going on or abuse. One of the hallmarks is if you have to ask yourself, is this abusive? It
Mm,
probably is. So if you suspect that there is emotional or verbal abuse going on, then your instincts are usually correct. And you, of course, we both are huge advocates for therapy and going and getting the support you need as well as encouraging the other person. But typically your instincts are correct.
yeah. Gosh, that really hit home for me because I have been in that situation so many times myself where I'm like, shit, I think this may be, some form of abuse, or I think this may be really toxic or
Hmm.
really unhealthy.
Yeah,
The fact that I'm even asking myself that is a red flag.
totally.
And the other thing I want to mention as we're talking about emotional abuse is as someone who's gone through physical abuse, that to me is a very short term pain and short term damage, where probably the majority of people, especially men, probably think the opposite. They're like, oh, physical abuse is like the worst ever. Like, as long as I don't do that, I am not a bad man. I am not a bad partner.
Totally.
But the majority, I wouldn't say the majority, a lot of abuse is in the form of being emotional and verbal. And that kind of abuse is something that you don't quickly recover from. And it can cause intense long term damage. And if you don't get that proper help, support, including choosing a secure and respectful partner in the future, I mean, this stuff stays with you and it can really affect every area of your life. At least for me, experience wise, caused extreme anxiety, panic attacks, anxiety attacks. My nervous system was super, dysregulated, and I won't even say it's completely regulated now. I mean, I like get spooked by the slightest noise, and I was never like that before entering that kind of
Mm,
relationship. And I
God,
noticed that
yeah.
I'm always on edge, and I'm always kind of like my heart is always, racing a bit, especially if I'm stressed or panicked or anything like that. And I truly do think that being in probably a few abusive relationships is what caused it.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. I understand. And you bring up a really good point about nervous system regulation, and in that relationships are supposed to be a net positive in your life. They are supposed to make you feel supported and loved and respected. And if you're feeling like your body can often give you cues before your mind can, just feeling tension in your body when you see that person and having these chronic nervous system reactions. And honestly, in situations of abuse, some of us get addicted to these nervous system highs and lows, these stress hormones. And these relationships are characterized, toxic relationship patterns are characterized by these extreme highs and lows. And you can actually get kind of addicted to that pattern, especially if your nervous system recognizes it from childhood and from feeling that way. Also, it's an old familiar feeling. And even if it's not a healthy one, it's still one that is almost comfortable to you because that's something that you encountered in childhood. And I have done a lot of reading about relationships and about conflict. And I have always found that interesting is even if something, that's why people can be attracted to sort of emotionally damaging people because they find that chaos that these relationships bring or that discomfort is similar to something that they experienced in childhood. And it doesn't make it healthy, but our bodies recognize that and kind of associate that with patterns that we are used to, even if they're not healthy.
I've heard that so many times, and I think about that. I'm like, is it me choosing the wrong partner and being attracted to someone that is so, not aligned with what I need? And it's just so hard for me to believe that because I am so tired of experiencing this, right? Like I I try to avoid this at all cost. I try to obviously working on myself. I try working on my shortcomings and the things that'll make me a better communicator. And so I would just feel like I would hopefully attract someone that is on the same page, but apparently, historically speaking, that is not the case. And toxic people love me. So what, what is it, Mary?
I don't mean to laugh at that. I understand,
Ah,
Carla, and I think honestly, just being aware of these patterns makes us and everyone else out there who is kind of more emotionally aware, we can recognize it. But I mean, there are so many different factors that go into attraction, right? Just chemistry, and it is
yes, exactly.
oftentimes people who are abusers are very, like we said earlier, like very charming, charismatic people. How can you not
I know.
be attracted to? And sometimes this behavior doesn't even come out till months into
Oh,
it when
years.
you're, yeah, when you're fully committed and you're really in
That's true.
love, or maybe you have children and it's not easy to just pack up and walk away. And one other thing I've noticed with the two kind of emotional abuse situations that I've been involved in is when you call out this behavior, usually the person is very resistant to it. In fact, he said, if you think I'm abusive, we 100% have a problem here. And that's because people who have these types of behavior patterns, emotional and verbal abuse, they think if they're not physically hitting someone, then they're not abusive. So
Yeah.
they think that the only kind of abuse is physical abuse, and they think that this yelling, name calling, belittling, gaslighting, that all that behavior is normal to
Yeah.
them, and or it's the other person's fault, and they don't consider it or are not even aware themselves that that is abusive and a very toxic pattern.
Yeah. Yeah. I've had an ex tell me, how how can you even say that what I'm doing is abusive when you've been in a physical abusive relationship? And I
Oh
was like,
God.
it's exactly. And that shows the ignorance
Yeah.
of, the ignorance and the immaturity and not being able to see themselves as a
That's the
person
problem.
as doing damage and is hurting someone they love. They can't even see that that is something that they're doing, even though you're telling them that it's hurting you. They're just in complete denial. And at the end of the day, I feel like it's not that they're necessarily a bad person, but they're incredibly immature if they can't, have the bandwidth to even have an open mind to listen to you and realize that, damn, this person is telling me I'm hurting them. And instead of apologizing or asking, how am I doing this? I'm just denying it and putting it back on them.
Yeah.
And that feels like shit.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Is one mark of a healthy relationship is if you, just like you said, is getting curious, asking questions, trying to understand the other person's reality. So if
Exactly.
I tell you this behavior makes me feel really bad, you're exactly right. The other person's response should be, "Oh my God, I'm sorry. I never want to make you feel that way. Can you tell me what that's like for you? Please tell me what I'm doing. How can we work through this? What do I need to do to show up in a way that makes you feel more safe and secure?" So, yeah, part of any kind of abuse, too, in my experience, is marked by a lot of not only self esteem issues, but as you mentioned, kind of emotional immaturity or kind of like emotionally stunted maturity levels that are characteristic from people who have gone through a lot of childhood trauma, also.
Yeah. Oh gosh. And unfortunately, as I think back, I think every person I've dated has some form, it's on the spectrum in terms of being very severe to not as severe. But I think any kind of childhood trauma, and when you say trauma, I think also men don't think of trauma as maybe, oh, I was criticized by my parent. That's still trauma. And
Mm,
that will still affect your future relationships, right?
hmm.
To, I was physically abused as a child, right? So there is a spectrum. And for whatever reason, my experience has been that men only see things black and white. I am abusive. I'm not abusive. I did have childhood trauma. I didn't have childhood trauma. And as long as they believe that, I don't think there's any
Mm,
motive to
hmm.
better themselves.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. The black and white thinking is a huge problem too, because there's an enormous amount of gray area. So that's a good point too. So hopefully this episode has resonated with people out there and reached the people that it needs to reach, because like you said, Carla, you're coming out is a really brave act, and it's designed to help other people who might be in the situation and not know it, and to save them the pain and the heartbreak, and to encourage everybody who might be experiencing this, or if you have a friend who's coming to you saying, I got in a fight with my significant other and here's what happened, and you're able to identify, hey, that sounds abusive, get some help. I think therapy for both parties involved is always the way forward.
Yeah. And I don't want to downplay like physical abuse because I had many experiences where it's weird to think or say out loud, but I could have died in certain situations. And so it is definitely a dangerous, very serious situation to be in. And if that's the case, you know, I would say just get your things and leave. Like, don't even wait for the therapy.
Oh,
Like
yeah. Go
that
for
that's your
physical. Yeah.
safety. Yes, exactly. But obviously, if it's more emotional and verbal, and there's no physical involvement, then I think therapy is a great first step. So I just want to make sure that people understand the difference. And I know that sounds incredibly obvious, but again, me having that experience, I didn't leave until it was too late, way too late. And so sometimes we just need a reminder.
Yeah. Thanks for mentioning that too. And it's an incredible act of bravery to walk away from any abusive situation. And if you're in bodily harm's way, then it's most important for you to look after yourself first.
Yeah, absolutely. So heavy topic today, but hopefully, if this helped at least one person, I'm glad we talked about it.